In the name of God, the most gracious and compassionate. The Muslim theologian Ibn Taymiyya believed that the attributes of God are not metaphors. To support his position, he cites early scholars of Islam who affirmed the apparent meanings of divine attributes in Revelation, while also affirming that these divine attributes are not equal to the attributes of creation. Ibn Taymiyya states in his exposition of the Muslim creed, known as the Wasitiyya, that early Muslims affirmed the apparent meanings of divine attributes without distorting their meanings, negating them, defining their modality, or likening them to the attributes of creation. Ibn Taymiyya summarized this theological position nicely by saying that the meanings of God's attributes are known, although their kayfiyya, or modality, is unknown. He argued that God's attributes are comprehensible and that it is only by understanding God's attributes that we come to know and love God. Still, he believed that we should not inquire into the details of God's essence beyond what is explicitly mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith. To inquire into God's modality, also known as takyeef, is blameworthy, for we will never fully comprehend the perfect nature of God with our limited intellect. In this video, we explain what Ibn Taymiyya believed about one of the divine attributes of God, namely his act of descending. But before we do that, let's first illustrate his theological principle with a simpler example. God mentions in the Quran. The Jews say, God's hand is fettered. Their hands are fettered, and they are accursed for saying so. Nay, but both his hands are spread out wide in bounty. He bestoweth as he will. Ibn Taymiyya affirms that the verse proves that God's hands are not merely metaphorical, God really has two hands. The very meaning of a hand which grabs and makes things is what Ibn Taymiyya advocated as the correct interpretation. Ibn Taymiyya also believed in further religious texts that describe God's hands in more detail. According to Ibn Taymiyya, it would not be wrong to affirm that God has 5 fingers in his hand, that his right hand and left hand are equally blessed, and that he has a palm, for these details have already been attributed to God in the authentic narrations. Nonetheless, Ibn Taymiyya affirms that the hands of God are not equal to the hands of creation. Because God is eternal and independent whereas the creations are originated and dependent, God's hands are by extension maximally perfect and different to the hands of creation. Now, because Ibn Taymiyya believed that God and his creations are different, he disapproved of inquiring into the modality of God's hands or any of his other attributes. The meaning of God's hands is known, but the modality is unknown. Although Ibn Taymiyya affirms God's attribute, he warns us from takyeef. Takyeef is to question how God is, by inquiring into descriptions which God has not revealed to us. Ibn Taymiyya believed that it is a part of faith to not inquire about the details which God did not mention, and this is why the companions of the Prophet did not involve themselves in takyeef, they were complete in faith and piety. Ibn Taymiyya notes that the people who fell into takyeef were later figures who were less faithful and knowledgeable. He gave examples of later heretics who described God as having black locks of hair that shine with a black light, despite not having any scriptural evidence for that. Another example is a man who once asked Imam Malik about how God sits on the throne, and in response, Imam Malik was outraged and ordered the man out of the mosque. Such foolishness is what Ibn Taymiyya, Imam Malik, and the leading scholars of Islam were guarding the Muslims against when they objected to takyeef. The things we do not know should be neither affirmed nor negated, and a believer ought to fear God and speak of him only in the best ways. In many verses in the Quran, God forbids us from saying about him what we do not know. In contrast to Ibn Taymiyya's position, the Kalam theologians negated many divine attributes mentioned in Revelation and reinterpreted them. They argued that these attributes have to be understood metaphorically because their apparent meanings would contradict sound reason. For the Kalam theologians, it is crucial to reinterpret the parts of Revelation which mention the face of God, his 2 hands, and that he created Adam in his image, because the apparent meanings of these verses and authentic narrations contradict sound reason in their opinion. The Kalam theologians sought to provide arguments for the necessity of metaphorical reinterpretation. One of the arguments they mentioned is a verse in the Quran which mentions that God is with us. They claimed that if the apparent meaning of the verse is affirmed, we will fall into the serious theological error of affirming that God is spatially within his creation. These and other texts must therefore be reinterpreted in new ways that conform to reason, they said. In the same way, they argued that God's hand should be reinterpreted to mean God's power. Ibn Taymiyya strongly disagreed. He opposed the reinterpretations of Kalam theologians as he believed that this is a distortion of the meanings of revelation as intended by God. Yet Ibn Taymiyya was not a literalist. He did not stick to literal meanings of words without considering their contexts. He instead argued that the meanings of words should be affirmed as understood from their contexts. He also believed that nothing of the apparent meanings in revelation contradicts sound reason. Ibn Taymiyya believed that the obvious meaning of a hand, as understood from the context of the verse, is the meaning of a hand that we should attribute to God, because it is that meaning which the verse indicates. Likewise, the plain meaning of the verse which mentions that God is with us should be affirmed. However, for Ibn Taymiyya, the plain meaning of this verse does not at all indicate that God is spatially next to us. The context is instead about the presence of God's knowledge, not about spatial proximity. Interpreting the verse to mean that God is perfectly knowing is not an act of reinterpretation according to Ibn Taymiyya, but is simply to affirm the meaning that is plainly understood from the context. Now, there exists a beautiful yet somewhat puzzling narration about one of God's divine attributes. It is known as the Hadith of Divine Descending. It is recorded in sound chains of narration that the Prophet Muhammad, may God elevate his mention, taught his companions that God descends to the lowest heaven every night when 2/3 of the night are over. God then stays there for a whole third of the night, answering his servants, before ascending again when dawn arrives. Imam Muslim recorded in his Hadith collection that Abu Huraira narrated. The Prophet of God said, "Our Lord descends every night to the lowest heaven when the last third of the night is left, and he says, 'Who supplicates to me so that I may answer him? Who asks of me so that I may give him? Who asks for my forgiveness so that I may forgive him?'" As you might have guessed, Ibn Taymiyya was of the view that God descends in the plain sense. In consistency with his general theological position, he accepted the apparent meaning of divine descending, just as he equally accepted the apparent meanings of all of the other attributes of God. Kalam theologians, on the other hand, reinterpreted the meaning of descending in the Hadith to mean that God's mercy, his command, or an angel descend to the first heaven. In their opinion, Ibn Taymiyya falls into a contradiction when he attributes the plain sense of descending to God. For example, Kalam theologians may point out that the earth is round. The last third of the night is always somewhere on the earth. Therefore, if the apparent meaning of this hadith is accepted instead of their reinterpretation of it, a logical contradiction will arise. God will always be in a state of descending to the first heaven, and will likewise always be in a state of ascending from it. It follows from this that God cannot possibly descend in the plain sense, and that Ibn Taymiyya's position entails a logical contradiction. In this way, using this hadith as an example, Kalam theologians argue that Ibn Taymiyya was wrong to reject their methods of reinterpretation. Today, when questioned about how God descends to the lowest heaven, many Muslim scholars respond with the general answer which Ibn Taymiyya provided, that the meaning is known, but the kayfiyya or modality is unknown. They will say, for example, that we do know what descending to the lowest heaven means, and that we do understand that it entails that God draws closer, but that we do not know how God does it, and so we should not conclude that it entails a contradiction. Here is how the Egyptian scholar Muhammad Salah answers the question.
This question is very, very important, and it was answered in the course of Aqidah, in the chapter of the unity of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question says, how does Allah the Almighty descend to the lowest sky in the last part of the night to answer prayer? How is this possible? Very good. Number one, the hadith which refers to that, it says that the Prophet ﷺ has said that Allah the Almighty descends to our worldly heaven, to our worldly sky, which is the lowest sky, because you know that as-samawat, or the heavens, consists of 7 layers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends to our worldly heaven, and He stretches out His hand and He says, is there any sa'il fa'u'tiyahu? Is there anyone who's asking for anything, so I shall give him? Is there any mustaghfir, seeking forgiveness, so that I shall forgive him his sins? And so on. Every night, during the last 1/3 of the night, right before Fajr. How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descend That question is answered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only because we don't know. So He descends in a manner that suits Him, but we don't know how. Does He descend, or is it a metaphor? No, He does descend. How? When you say possible and not possible, that only if you can comprehend that, if you can visualize it. But none of us, not a single human being, have got to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in reality, physically. That will be possible in Jannah, inshaAllah Azza Jal, in heaven. But in this dunya, no one have. So how would it be possible to imagine how Allah the Greatest descends to the worldly heaven? He says He does, so without ta'wil, without interpretation, without ta'til, without neglecting the meaning entirely, without saying no, it doesn't happen, it's not possible, as part of the question says, we believe in it as it is, without giving different interpretation to it.
Although I believe that this statement by Shaykh Muhammad Salat is true, I believe that this answer is many times insufficient. Yes, we do not know how God really descends. But one who asks about how God descends is not necessarily asking about the modality of His act of descending. He may instead be intending to say that for God to descend in the plain sense, He must leave His throne and become under it, and therefore that descending in the plain sense is problematic. Also, he might be making an analogy between the plain sense of the divine descending and certain logical contradictions which Muslims reject on rational grounds, such as the Trinity affirmed by the Christians. After all, didn't Ibn Taymiyya and the Kalam theologians agree that many statements about God are logically incoherent and should not be ascribed to God? They did indeed. It is no secret that Muslim scholars believed that many theological positions are false because they entail contradictions and are in conflict with God's necessary perfection. For example, Ibn Taymiyya believed that it is logically impossible for God to enter into the world, because God is greater than His creation and may not be contained by the heavens. It would be unacceptable to claim that God enters into the world even if it is additionally asserted that the modality in which this happens is unknown. This is because if God is encompassed by the heavens would be greater than Him by necessity. The necessary perfection of God would be contradicted, as the heavens would be greater than the Creator. This is both logically impossible and contradicts revelation. This is also one of the ways the believers can know on purely rational grounds that the Antichrist is lying in claiming to be the God of Abraham. The Antichrist is surely not God, because God is above the heavens, whereas the Antichrist is a tiny creation who walks here on the earth, just like all other human beings. In a similar fashion, Ibn Taymiyya believed that the Christian doctrine of incarnation is a logically impossible doctrine. It is impossible for God to become a man, because men are created and needy, whereas God is uncreated and self-sufficient. It is wrong to claim that God may become a man even if it is additionally asserted that the modality in which God does this is unknown, for there can exist no modality in which an impossible act of incarnation takes place. God does not possibly become a man, and man does not possibly become God, as this act entails a logical contradiction. Instead, God is eternal and uncreated, whereas the created things necessarily have a beginning. Now, Kalam theologians are convinced that the apparent meaning of descending is logically impossible for God. They claim that God may not descend to the first heaven in the plain sense if He is also said to be always above the throne. They are therefore rarely convinced by an approach that delegates the kaifiyya or modality to God, for they hold that there is no modality in which such an act may occur. For this reason, Ibn Taymiyya does much more to resolve this difficulty, and he authors an entire book to explain the Hadith of divine descending. I wish the Shaykh Muhammad Salah had given the full answer that was mentioned in that book. Although I do accept the general answer he provided, I have noticed that such an answer can sometimes be misunderstood. The answer which he gives may lead some people to become more agnostic towards the apparent meanings of God's attributes, such as the meaning of His face and His hands. One may mistakenly think that Muhammad Salat is saying that God's descending is radically different in such a way that it does not involve God becoming spatially closer. If God descends without really drawing closer, one may say, then maybe God is describing Himself as having two hands when He is actually speaking about something that is radically different to the meaning which we understand, such that the predication would be equivocal and not analogical. So how does Ibn Taymiyya respond to the Kalam theologians, And how does he explain the plain sense of descending in the Hadith? In his work that explains the Hadith of descending, Ibn Taymiyya maintains that God descends by drawing closer to his creation spatially. Nevertheless, he does not accept that God leaves his throne and becomes under it. If God's descending to the lowest heaven is understood in a sense that involves God leaving his throne and entering into the heavens, many contradictions would arise according to Ibn Taymiyya. One of these contradictions is that God will be contained within the heavens, when it is in fact logically impossible for anything to contain God, for he is greater than all things. Secondly, because the earth is round, and because the night is longer in some places on the earth than it is at others, God must always be in a state of descending in such a case. If God descends by leaving his throne, it will follow that he is always underneath his throne, and his existence above the throne will therefore be invalidated. After all, God may not be both above the throne and underneath it at the same time, as no entity can exist in two different places at once. Also, Ibn Taymiyya insists that such an interpretation of divine descending contradicts revelation. The Quran clearly mentions that God sat on his throne after the 6 days of creation. This implies that the throne was never empty of God since then. For these reasons, Ibn Taymiyya argues that God does not leave his throne when he descends. To strengthen his position, he mentions reports from the early Muslim scholars. Leading scholars such as Ahmed bin Hanbal, Ishaq bin Rahawayh, and Hamad bin Zayd have stated that God does not leave his throne upon descending. The other few scholars who claim that God leaves his throne are known to be mistaken by evidence of sound reason in the revealed texts, Ibn Taymiyya maintains. According to the early Muslim scholars, it is possible for God to descend to the first heaven without leaving his throne. Next, Ibn Taymiyya provides a fuller explanation of this understanding of divine descending. He mentions that God's descending is relative to different people in different places on the earth. God really descends to the heaven over some people on one part of the earth, in their last third of the night, while not descending to the heaven above a different people on another part of the earth until their last third of the night comes in. He then ascends from the heaven above the first people at dawn, while descending to the heaven above the others when their last third of the night comes in. In this way, God is always descending to the first heaven and ascending from it, without leaving his place above the throne. This divine descent is real, because God is really drawing closer to his servants spatially. Still, it is not a descent which involves God existing in two different places simultaneously, because God is not leaving his throne as he descends. In response to Kalam theologians who disagree with this unavoidable explanation, Ibn Taymiyya stresses that motion is not one kind. There exist different types of motion in creation which do not entail that a creation moves out of its place. He illustrates this with the example of the human soul. Revelation teaches that the human souls are not properties of human bodies, but are instead physical entities that can become separate from the human body. The soul is a physical entity which, together with the human body, comprises the human being. Indeed, many of the texts mention that the human soul ascends and descends, that it is subject to reward and punishment, and that it leaves the human body after death. This means that the human soul is not an attribute, but is a physical entity that has a spatial location. Nevertheless, Ibn Taymiyya maintains that the soul and the body are radically different. The descriptions that are attributed to the soul, therefore, are different from the descriptions that are attributed to the body inasmuch as the soul and the body are different. For this reason, the motions that apply to the human bodies need not be equal to the motions that apply to the human souls. For example, scriptural reports seem to indicate that the human soul sometimes ascends to the heavens while still existing within the human body. This motion is a very different kind of motion that may not be predicated of the body, says Ibn Taymiyya. A human body does not ascend without leaving its place, but this is not necessarily true of a human soul. Now, if Kalam theologians come to accept this kind of motion in the human soul, then by what evidence do they negate the apparent meaning of divine descending that is mentioned in the Hadith? After all, God's descending need not be of the kind that is predicated of the human bodies. He need not leave his place when he descends. Clearly, the difference between God and creation is far greater than the difference between one creation and another, between the human body and the human soul. In this way, Ibn Taymiyya argues in favor of the plain sense of descending as mentioned in the Hadith, God draws closer to his creation spatially by descending to the lowest heaven. But he also believes that the meaning of divine descending ought to be understood correctly and guarded against false interpretations. God does not descend by leaving his throne and entering into the heavens. In addition to the scriptural evidence of the motions of human souls, there exists another example that illustrates that entities do not necessarily leave their places as they approach each other spatially. This example was unknown to Ibn Taymiyya in his time. Physicists today are in agreement over the fact that bodies may approach each other spatially without moving out of their places. Take a closer look at this short animated diagram. This animation illustrates Einstein's general theory of relativity. According to the theory, the right and left diagrams are equally true. The left diagram is true for an observer on the Earth in the yellow solar system, and the right diagram is just as true for an observer who is traveling in the white rocket. Although both observers, the one on Earth and the one in the rocket, agree on the ontological existence of things, including the blue and orange stars and the yellow sun, the distances measured in each reference frame are different. This is known in the theory of relativity as length contraction. According to the theory, what you see on the left is what is really happening with respect to a person on the Earth, and what you see on the right is what is really happening with respect to the traveler in the white rocket. With respect to the traveler, the blue star really approaches the yellow and orange stars before then departing, although the stars do not approach one another with respect to the observer who is on the Earth. Still, all observers agree on the fact that the stars do not move out of their fixed orbits. Note that my intention is not to claim that the theory of relativity in its current form is compatible with revelation. I actually believe that the theory of relativity is incorrect in its current form, because it contradicts the enormous speeds at which angels are supposed to travel through the heavens. According to the theory of relativity, it is logically impossible for information to travel faster than the speed of light. This is why I believe that the theory is at best incomplete. My intention here is not to argue in favor of the theory, but only to illustrate that reason does not know that a thing cannot descend without leaving its place. I am simply pointing out that the fundamental claims of the theory have a precedent in the creed of the early Muslims. Yes, reason will never be able to fully comprehend how God descends, for that is a divine act. However, reason does understand what it means for God to descend. For example, it understands that God draws closer to his creation spatially without leaving his place. Furthermore, reason can have no certainty in the claim that the plain meaning of divine descending entails a logical contradiction. A believer knows that a truthful prophet teaches only truthful things. He understands that God's prophets do not teach logically impossible doctrines like the Trinity or an existence of multiple gods. But although a believer believes that the statements of the prophets conform to reason and are free from all contradiction, he nevertheless accepts that the prophets of God may teach many strange things which we may never be able to fully grasp. He accepts that everything the prophets taught about the matters of the unseen is true, even if the details are not clear to us. It is perfectly rational to believe in everything a true prophet teaches. Even if our reason is unable to affirm the actual possibility of some unseen matter that a prophet mentions, the actual possibility of that unseen matter can still be accepted on purely scriptural grounds. It suffices to be unaware of whether a matter is actually possible in order to then accept it based on revelation. We do not have to prove that some claim is actually possible in order to believe in it. We can always take the word of a truthful prophet on that, for the prophet is taught by God, who is the knower of all things. However, if some matter is known with certainty to entail a logical contradiction, then this is clear evidence that it is not from God. Also, note that it is deeply irrational for someone to reject scriptural information merely because it was not given to him or because he was unable to know it empirically as a prophet did. Finally, before this video comes to a close, let us stress an important lesson from this beautiful hadith. The hadith of divine descending motivates us to pray in the heart of the night, at a time when most people are asleep and no one is watching but God. The hadith encourages us to do so by informing us that God is drawing closer to us and is mercifully calling on us to repent and ask of his unlimited favors. The night prayers are also one of the greatest causes of tranquility and happiness throughout the day. The light that remains in the faces of the worshippers who pray in that time explains Ibn Taymiyya, is one of the blessings of that divine act of descending. May God allow us to be among those who have the greatest share in this blessing. The last of our prayers is: all praise is due to God, the Lord of creation.